Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. I never saw it coming. My marriage to Laura was the one thing I had thought of as unshakable. We'd been together for over 15 years, having built a life from scratch. We had the house, the careers, the memories, all the little tokens that signaled we'd made it. But a few months back, something shifted, almost imperceptibly, like the barely audible crack of ice underfoot. At first, I brushed it off as stress or the endless cycle of routines that can dull even the brightest sparks. But her distance grew, as did the subtle changes in her behavior. It started with the smaller things, a hesitant look before a smile, her phone clutched a bit tighter than usual. She would say she was just busy or tired from work. I wanted to believe her, so I did. Then came the late nights, each one wrapped in the same explanation, a tight project deadline, a last-minute meeting, some ambiguous work obligation. I played the supportive husband, reassuring her that I understood. Yet, a quiet doubt grew within me, a low hum in the back of my mind that refused to quiet down. I had no concrete reason to suspect her, no sudden changes in our lives beyond the subtle hints she was inadvertently leaving. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Deep down, I knew. And yet, I didn't want to know. It was a Friday night when the dam broke. We were at a dinner party with friends, laughing and reminiscing, surrounded by people we had known for years. Laura was unusually quiet, barely responding when people spoke to her. I chalked it up to work exhaustion again, that ever-ready excuse, and tried to enjoy the evening. But I caught her glancing at her phone under the table. A few seconds later, it vibrated, and she was up from her seat, moving toward the restroom. She left her purse at the table, but her phone was conspicuously missing from its usual place. I took a sip of my wine, a slow burn forming in my chest. My mind was racing with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Had she been doing this all along, leaving the table to check her phone, stepping outside for air? I tried to focus on the conversation, but my mind wouldn't stay put. When she returned, there was something different in her eyes, something hidden, yet pleading to stay unseen. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers right there. But we were surrounded by friends. I reminded myself that this was neither the time nor the place. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, my responses automatic, my laughter forced. On the drive home, silence settled between us like an invisible wall. I gripped the steering wheel, stealing glances at her as she looked out the window, as though fascinated by the blur of streetlights. Her silence was heavy, pregnant with thoughts she refused to share. "You okay?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. "Yeah," she said quickly, too quickly. "Just tired." I nodded, keeping my doubts to myself, but they pressed harder against the boundaries I had set, trying to break free. I was done ignoring them. That night, as she slept soundly beside me, I lay awake, wide-eyed in the dark, rehearsing words I hadn't yet found the courage to say aloud. The next morning, I decided to let my guard down a little. I told her I would make breakfast, a rare thing, given our usual weekend routine of ordering out. I wanted to be there for her, to see if she would open up, offer some explanation without my having to pry it from her. But the morning passed without a single reference to last night. She smiled and thanked me for breakfast, then retreated into her phone, her fingers typing fast as she glanced up every so often to see if I was watching. That was it. The moment my restraint finally snapped. I hadn't intended to go through her phone, it was a boundary I respected, something I believed in. But when she left it on the counter to grab a towel from the bathroom, I found myself drawn to it like a magnet, my hand hesitating only for a second. Her screen lit up under my touch, revealing a stream of notifications I didn't recognize. There was a string of messages from someone named Jason, a name that hadn't come up in our conversations before. The messages weren't long, but they carried a familiarity that struck me as odd. Phrases like, "last night was amazing," and "can't wait to see you again," flashed across the screen, each one driving another nail into the coffin of my trust. She reappeared in the doorway, hair wrapped in a towel, catching me before I had time to react. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, we stared at each other in silent horror. I could see her mentally calculating a dozen responses, each one more implausible than the last. Before she could say anything, I set the phone down, my expression betraying nothing. I simply said, "Do you want to explain?" She didn't. Instead, she clammed up, her face twisting into a strange mix of anger and guilt. "Why were you on my phone?" she snapped, her voice higher than usual, defensive. I wanted to shout, to tell her this was her moment to come clean, to be honest. But all I managed was a calm, "It doesn't matter how I saw it, Laura. I think we both know what's going on here." She crossed her arms, defensiveness pouring from her as she tried to spin it into my fault. "You're invading my privacy," she hissed, her face growing red. "I'm your husband. We've been together for 15 years, Laura. Whatever this is, whoever he is, this doesn't stay private." There was a part of me that hoped she would break down, admit the mistake, let her guilt finally spill over into the apology I deserved. But instead, she grabbed her phone from the counter, storming out of the kitchen with a final, cutting remark, "Maybe we should talk about this when you've calmed down." I stood there, feeling hollow, my world beginning to tilt on its axis. The house felt eerily silent in the days that followed, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. I tried to keep things as normal as possible for the sake of routine, telling myself I would figure out the right time to address the growing rift between Laura and me. But every morning, I found myself staring into my coffee, waiting for some word or explanation, anything that would bring clarity. Laura's behavior became more guarded. She kept her phone close, always clutching it like a lifeline. Her excuses grew even flimsier, her words sprinkled with half-truths and vague promises that we would talk soon. The weight of her evasion pressed down on me, thickening the air between us. But no matter how I tried to engage her, she would sidestep, turning every question into a deflection, an accusation, or, at worst, silence. One night, unable to bear the tension, I went to bed early. I lay in the dark, eyes wide open, listening as Laura paced around downstairs, murmuring softly on her phone. The conversation was muffled, but I caught glimpses, little slivers of her whispered words. "I'll find a way," she was saying. "You don't need to worry about him." My fists clenched under the covers, the words slicing through me like ice. The anger that had been simmering for days finally boiled over. I slipped out of bed, padding quietly to the top of the stairs. I waited until I heard her say, "I have to go." The click of her phone cutting off echoed in the darkness. She stood in the dim light of the kitchen, her face turned away, and I saw her exhale, her body deflating. She had no idea I was watching. "Are you going to tell me what's going on, or do I have to keep piecing it together on my own?" My voice was low, carrying the weight of days of pent-up frustration. She spun around, her face a mask of guilt, quickly replaced by defiance. "You're overreacting." "It's nothing," she said, too quickly. "Don't lie to me, Laura. Don't insult me like that." I took a step forward, letting her feel the gravity of the situation. "You were talking to him, weren't you? Jason." Her face flushed, a flicker of panic darting across her eyes. She tried to brush past me, but I blocked her path. "Answer me." She crossed her arms, anger flashing in her eyes. "What do you want me to say? That you've been suffocating me? That you've been making it impossible to breathe? Is that what you want to hear?" I felt a surge of anger. "This isn't about me, Laura. Don't turn this into something it's not. I'm asking you a simple question, and you can't even answer it without pointing fingers." Her face twisted, a hint of guilt slipping through the cracks of her defiance. "Fine," she muttered. "Yes, I've been talking to him. He's been a friend. Someone I can talk to without judgment. A friend? The words came out like a bitter laugh. Is that all he is? She hesitated, her face tightening as though she were weighing her options. It doesn't matter, she finally said. What matters is that I don't feel like I have anything left with you. We go through the motions, day after day, and I feel like I'm slowly disappearing. Jason makes me feel seen. It felt like a punch to the gut. She was staring at me, daring me to argue, but the words were stuck in my throat. After all these years, after everything we'd built together, this was where we'd ended up. So that's it, then. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You're ready to throw everything away because I'm not enough for you anymore. Her gaze dropped, guilt twisting her expression, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flash of regret. But then her chin lifted defiantly. I didn't plan for this to happen, you know. I didn't plan to fall out of love with you. The words hung heavy in the air, each one a sharp edge cutting into me. You know, there's still a way to fix this, I said, clinging to the last shreds of hope. If you want to. She didn't respond, her silence louder than any words could have been. The look in her eyes was one I'd seen before, years ago, when she'd made up her mind about leaving her old job. It was a look that said she had already chosen her path, and nothing I said or did would change it. I felt my own resolve hardening. Fine, I said. If that's how you feel, if you're that willing to throw this away, then don't expect me to sit here and let it happen without a fight. Her eyes flashed with surprise. What are you saying? I didn't answer. Instead, I walked away, each step filled with the realization that I was done playing the role of the clueless husband. She had made her choice, but she wasn't going to leave without consequence. I would be ready. Over the next week, I began gathering what I needed. I contacted a lawyer discreetly, arranging for the protection of my assets, the house, and any finances that could be frozen without alerting her. I was careful, meticulous, waiting for the right moment to bring everything crashing down. Every night, Laura continued slipping into her pattern, quiet phone calls, hurried explanations, deflective excuses. Each one only deepened the well of betrayal within me, solidifying my plan. One night, as she left her phone unattended in the living room, I couldn't resist. I picked it up, scrolling through her messages, piecing together a story I'd once refused to believe. There, in plain text, were the final, damning messages between her and Jason. Words of intimacy, promises of a future, declarations I had once thought were reserved for me. It was more than enough to confirm what I had already known but refused to fully accept. When she came back, she saw me holding her phone, her face freezing in an instant. Give that to me, she snapped, her voice cold. I handed it over, my face a mask of calm as I said, you know, I've always trusted you. Believed you. Thought you were better than this. Her expression shifted, a mixture of defiance and something that almost looked like regret. But the fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow indifference that hurt more than any confession ever could. What do you want from me, Matt? She said, her voice barely a whisper. I want my wife back, I said. But I see now that's never going to happen. She didn't respond, and after a moment, she turned and walked away, disappearing up the stairs without a word. In the days that followed, I operated on autopilot, carefully curating each detail of my plan with a precision I didn't know I had. Laura was oblivious, continuing her secretive routine as if we were stuck in some twisted, unwritten script. I observed her, every movement and glance, storing away each piece of evidence I needed to sever our lives from one another without her knowing what was coming. The nights were the hardest, her phone calls and whispers were like nails in a coffin, sealing us away from each other, word by word. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one morning, the light slanting across the room as I scrolled through the tracker app on my phone. It was discreetly linked to her phone now, and I knew her every location, every text, every call. I'd become someone I didn't recognize, calculating and watchful, no longer the trusting husband but a stranger waiting to strike. And yet, somehow, it felt right, like I was reclaiming control, one small detail at a time. I knew she'd be meeting Jason that evening. I'd seen the reservation she'd made at a restaurant 2 towns over, using a card she thought I wouldn't see. But I did, and I planned to see a lot more than that. I'd hired a private investigator to meet me there, someone to document what I knew I could no longer deny. I needed the truth in black and white, in evidence so undeniable that she couldn't talk her way out of it. It was time. That evening, I waited in the car outside the restaurant, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched them enter. The investigator had a clear shot through the window, snapping photos from every angle as they sat down, laughing, leaning close, sharing that intimacy I had once believed was mine alone. I didn't feel sadness or jealousy anymore, just a grim satisfaction. She was making this easy. After nearly an hour, they left, her arm wrapped around Jason as they walked down the street, laughing. I watched until they disappeared into a nearby hotel. I felt the investigator's hand on my shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, but I shrugged it off, unable to tear my eyes away from the door they'd gone through. It was over. Whatever thread of doubt or hope I'd been clinging to had snapped, and all that was left was the certainty that I would end this my way. The next morning, I confronted her with the evidence. I didn't give her a chance to talk, to worm her way out of the truth. I laid it all out, the photos, the texts, the reservations, the hotel stays. Every shred of deception laid bare, leaving her nowhere to hide. She stared at me, her face a mix of shock and something that looked like fear, but she didn't try to deny it. Instead, she simply whispered, "Why couldn't you just let it go, Matt?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, the way she could turn it around as if I were the one who had broken us. "Because I'm not some fool you can toss aside when you're bored, Laura. You can't just rewrite our life like it doesn't matter." She looked away, her silence a confession of guilt she couldn't escape. "So what now?" she asked quietly. I leaned forward, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. "Now, we end this. I'm filing for divorce, Laura. And you're not going to get a damn thing." Her eyes widened, a flash of panic breaking through her calm. "You can't do that," she said, her voice trembling. "I gave up so much for us. This house, my job, everything. I deserve something." "Deserve?" I scoffed. "What exactly do you think you deserve, Laura? You've spent months betraying everything we built, and you think you're owed something?" Her face paled as I laid out the rest of my plan. I'd been careful, more meticulous than she ever would have guessed, making sure that every asset we held together was protected. The house was legally under my name, as were most of the savings accounts. Her name was nowhere on the business I'd built from scratch. The lawyer I'd consulted assured me that my assets were secure, and with the evidence of her affair, I had the upper hand. She'd get nothing, and she knew it. "You'll regret this, Matt," she spat, her eyes narrowing with a cold fury I hadn't seen before. "You think you're going to come out of this unscathed? This isn't just about money. I could ruin you." I laughed, the sound hollow in the tense silence. "Go ahead, Laura. Try. But I have the evidence, and the truth has a way of coming out." I held up the photos one last time before tearing them in half, letting the pieces fall to the floor between us. "You did this to yourself." Her expression twisted into something unreadable, a mixture of anger, regret, and, was it pain? But it didn't matter anymore. I walked away, my heart hardening with every step. I'd spent too long fighting for something she'd thrown away, and I was finally done. The legal proceedings began the next week. I didn't tell her about the court date, she found out when the summons arrived in the mail. Every step of the process, I stayed one step ahead, blocking her attempts to negotiate, shutting down her arguments with the cold, hard evidence. She tried to appeal to my emotions, reminding me of the good years, the dreams we'd once shared. But I saw through her. I'd seen her with Jason, her laughter, her intimacy with him, those memories held no power over me anymore. I kept to myself during those weeks, ignoring her texts and calls. Friends asked where she was, but I simply said she was away. The truth was ours, a broken, fractured thing that I had no interest in sharing with anyone. And as each day passed, the weight lifted, replaced by a growing sense of freedom. One evening, I found myself in the kitchen, pouring a glass of whiskey as I stared out the window. The emptiness felt strange, yet liberating. I knew there was a long road ahead, the wreckage of our life to sift through, but for the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of peace. The silence wasn't hollow, it was healing. I took a long sip, the warmth spreading through me, and I realized that I was ready to let go, to move on. I didn't need revenge or apologies. I just needed this chapter of my life to end. Tomorrow, the papers would be signed, and Laura would be out of my life for good. The morning the papers were to be signed, I woke early. The house felt cold, even though it was spring. I sat alone in the quiet kitchen, staring at the stack of documents on the table, every line and clause carefully crafted to protect what was left of my life. By the end of the day, everything would be finalized, and she'd be out of my world for good. Laura arrived a few minutes before the lawyer. I didn't know if she'd actually show, but she walked through the door looking worn, a shadow of the woman I had loved for so long. Her eyes barely met mine as she took her seat across from me. I felt a twinge of regret, or maybe it was sadness, an echo of everything we had built and lost. For a brief moment, I wondered if there could have been another way. The lawyer went through the documents, his voice droning on, explaining each section in signature line. Laura nodded mechanically, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. I could tell she was holding back tears, her expression a strange mix of resignation and disbelief. But I kept my gaze fixed on the papers, reminding myself that this was what I had wanted. She'd made her choice, and I'd made mine. Finally, it was done. Laura scrawled her name across the last page, and with a quiet nod from the lawyer, she handed it back. He excused himself to finalize the filing, leaving the two of us alone in the house for what I knew would be the last time. Laura stood slowly, clutching her purse. Her mouth opened as if she wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she looked at me with eyes full of something I couldn't quite read. Regret? Pain? I didn't know. All I felt was a deep, hollow ache as I waited for her to leave, to end this chapter once and for all. As she turned to go, she hesitated by the door. She glanced over her shoulder, her face softened, and she gave me a look that felt painfully familiar, like the Laura I used to know, the one I had fallen in love with all those years ago. Matt. I know it doesn't change anything, but I am sorry. For everything. Her voice broke, and I could feel her words echo in the silence. I wanted to say something, to tell her that maybe, in another life, we could have found our way back to each other. But my pride held me back, and I watched as she left, the sound of the door closing behind her reverberating through the empty house. That night, the quiet felt different. Heavier. The finality of it all settled in, a weight pressing down on me. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the promise of a new beginning. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I poured myself a drink, staring into the glass as if it held answers I couldn't find. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence, and I reached for it absently, expecting a message from the lawyer. But it wasn't the lawyer. It was Laura. The message was brief, almost cryptic. I'm sorry for everything. I hope you can find happiness again someday. I loved you once. I think I always will. A chill ran through me as I read her words, a sense of dread settling in. Something was wrong. I knew it as surely as I knew my own name. I tried calling her, but the line went straight to voicemail. Panic clawed at my chest, and without thinking, I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. The drive to her apartment felt endless. I kept replaying our last conversation in my head, wondering if there was something I'd missed, something I could have said. My thoughts raced, and I cursed myself for letting her leave without a word. For holding on to my pride when I should have let it go. When I finally arrived, the building was eerily quiet. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my heart pounding as I reached her door. I knocked, my fist hitting the wood hard, but there was no answer. Desperation gnawed at me as I called out her name, my voice echoing down the empty hallway. Finally, I forced the door open. The apartment was dark, empty save for a few boxes scattered on the floor. I called her name again, my voice thick with fear. Silence answered me. But then, in the faint light from the street lamp outside, I saw her, a shadow slumped on the couch, barely visible in the gloom. "Laura," I whispered, my voice breaking as I crossed the room. She didn't respond, her body still, lifeless in the darkness. I reached out, my hands shaking as I touched her shoulder, my heart breaking at the coldness of her skin. The empty pill bottle on the table next to her told me everything I needed to know. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor beside her, the weight of the reality crashing over me. I sat there for what felt like hours, numb with shock and guilt, the memory of her last words haunting me. I'd thought I was ready to let her go, to end this chapter of our lives without a second thought. But now, in the darkened silence of her empty apartment, I realized just how much I had lost. The pain was overwhelming, a raw wound that cut deeper than anything I had ever known. I wanted to scream, to tear down the walls, to undo every choice that had led us here. But it was too late. The finality of it, the irrevocable end, was a weight I could never lift. I stumbled to my feet, my mind reeling, and made the call. The paramedics arrived, their faces solemn as they took her away, leaving me alone in the empty apartment, haunted by the silence, the ghosts of what once was. The lawyer would finish the paperwork tomorrow. The divorce would be finalized, her name erased from my life. But her absence would linger, an indelible mark on my soul. As I drove home in the early hours of the morning, the world felt colder, the weight of my choices pressing down with unbearable force. I had wanted revenge, justice, a clean break from the betrayal she had inflicted. But now, all I wanted was one last chance to tell her I forgave her, to tell her I understood, that maybe, despite everything, we could have found a way back. But she was gone. And there would be no forgiveness, no second chances. Just an empty house, an empty heart, and the memory of what we had lost. In the days that followed, I tried to move forward, to let go of the pain and the guilt. But her absence was a void that nothing could fill, a haunting reminder of the cost of pride and resentment. I would live with the regret for the rest of my life, a silent echo in the empty rooms of the life we had once shared, now nothing more than a distant, aching memory.